Good evening, everybody. We'll get started. You'll probably hear the dinging of people joining in. People usually trickle in for about 15 minutes or so after we've started the presentation. But for everybody on the line, good evening and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for a special Halloween webinar in celebration of Bat Week. My name is Sydney. I'm the marine specialist over here at Pacific Wild, and I will be one of your presenters this evening. I'm also joined tonight by Juliana Laposa Wild. Juliana is the Wildlife Stewardship Coordinator at the Habitat Acquisition Trust and will be co-presenting tonight about bats in British Columbia. Before we get started, I'll just start off with a little bit of housekeeping. During the presentation this evening, please ensure that your microphones are turned off and write any questions that you may have throughout the presentation in the chat feature. And then we'll have a discussion and answer some questions after the presentation's done. And for those of you that weren't on the call already, we are recording the presentation this evening. So if you're comfortable having your camera on, that's great. If you're not comfortable with being recorded, I would just have your camera off for the duration of the presentation, because we're going to make it available to people who weren't able to attend in person. So welcome to Creepin' It Real, Bat Myths, Facts, and Conservation. Tonight we will be celebrating the often overlooked and unsung hero of our nights, the bat. So without further ado, we'll get into it. So here's a little brief outline for our agenda this evening. We'll do a bit of an introduction. I'll introduce Pacific Wild, who we are and what we do if you're unfamiliar with our work. And then Juliana will let you all know about Habitat Acquisition Trust and a little bit about what Bat Week is all about and what we're celebrating tonight. I will do a little bit of Bat 101, so bat biology, and introduce you to some of the bats found here in British Columbia and on Vancouver Island specifically. And then we'll get into the more of the dark stuff. We'll talk about some threats to bats. We'll do bats in folklore, myths about bats, and then we'll bring it back and we'll do some bat conservation and how you can get involved in conserving bats. So Pacific Wild, if you're not familiar, we're a charity that supports the protection of ecosystems that can sustain biodiversity throughout the Pacific Northwest region. We support public education, community outreach, innovative research, and raising conservation awareness to achieve the goal of lasting environmental protections for the lands, waters, and wildlife that we live in through legislative change. And I will pass it off to Juliana to go over Habitat Trust.
Hi, everyone. As Sydney mentioned, I'm the Wildlife Stewardship Coordinator at Habitat Acquisition Trust, also known as HAT. HAT is a local nonprofit. We work to protect and conserve nature on Southern Vancouver Island and the Gulf Islands through protection, collaboration, stewardship, and education. And then HAT also runs the Southern Vancouver Island chapter of the BC Community Bat Program, which is a network of bat programs across BC. It's run in partnership with the Ministry of Environment. And the goals of the BC Community Bat Program are to increase the number of known bat roosting sites in human-made structures. We provide information to the public to help protect bat roost sites and help folks with bat-friendly exclusion methods when necessary. We also promote the annual bat count and white nose syndrome monitoring to track bat populations. And we advocate for enhancing bat habitat through the installation and monitoring of bat boxes and also bat-friendly gardening practices. So happy Bat Week, everybody. Bat Week is an international celebration. It happens from October 24th to the 31st. And it's all about raising awareness about these important and incredible creatures and busting some common bat myths that have unfortunately given bats a bad reputation. And during this week, people around the world participate in events to learn more about bats. So thank you so much for joining us to learn about bats today. And I'll pass it over to Sydney to talk about bat biology.
Okay, so I'm going to give you guys a really quick crash course to better get to know these amazing little creatures. First off the bat, let's bust the first bat myth right out of the gate this evening. Bats are not rodents. They actually belong to their own group of mammals or order called Chiroptera, which means hand wing. In fact, bats are more closely related to primates such as monkeys and us humans than they are to rodents. There are over 1,400 species of bats worldwide, making them the second most diverse order of mammals after the rodents that they often get confused for. So the wing of a bat is made of two layers of skin and kind of looks like an elongated finger. This unique adaptation allows bats to be the only mammal that are capable of true or sustained flight. And bat wings are a really perfect example of something that we call convergent evolution, especially when compared to other flying animals like birds and insects. So if you're not familiar, convergent evolution is a process where different species evolve similar biological traits or structures independently of one another to help solve similar problems. So in this case, how to fly. So as mentioned, the wings of bats are essentially elongated fingers covered by a thin membrane of skin. This is quite different from bird wings, which are modified forelimbs with feathers offering lift and surface area needed for flight. And then in insects, their wings have a completely different origin. For flight, developing wings from extensions in their exoskeleton. So there are two different kinds of bats. They're split into two main groups. So we've got the mega bats, which are your larger fruit bats, also commonly known as flying foxes. Those guys are typically found in tropical regions. They have really large eyes and primarily rely on their vision and smell for navigation. The ones that we have closer to home are our microbats. And they're smaller bats that are mostly insectivorous and use echolocation to navigate and hunt. So we'll get into busting myth number 2 of the evening, and that is the phrase blind as a bat. Bats, in fact, are not blind, and they probably see better than we do in dimly lit conditions. Some bats, those flying foxes, navigate using vision alone and appear to be able to see better even than owls. Microbats, so the smaller ones, produce a high frequency sound waves that bounce off objects, helping them to see in the dark. This is echolocation, and that's primarily used for hunting and navigation. And bats can adjust the frequency, duration, and intensity of these echolocation sounds that they make to improve the detection and accuracy within different environments. Bats are also very long-lived for small mammals.
Okay.
And their lifespans
Right.
range from about 5 to over 30 years. In BC, the little brown bat, who living up to its name only weighs about 6 to 7 grams,
Okay.
which is the same size as a loonie, or a Canadian $1 coin for those of you who may be from across the border. And those guys can live to be 39 years old, which is extremely impressive and unusual for a mammal with such a small body size. So bats usually give birth to one pup per year, although some species may have twins. In the late spring and summer, pregnant female bats often form maternity roosts or colonies. So roosting in a large group allows female to share body heat, which lowers the energetic costs for individuals, which is especially important for the females that are nursing. They want to be able to be as efficient as they can. And studies have shown that long-term patterns of association in some temperate bat species suggests a really high level of social complexity among female bats, which is akin to other large mammal species that we know to be social. So really diverse social lives of these female bats, the ones that roost together, which is pretty cool. Like I mentioned earlier, bats are mammals. So like us, they give birth to live young and their newborns suckle milk. Baby bats called pups can't fly when they're born, but they can cling to their mothers or to the walls of their roosts. So in BC, pups typically grow to their full size in only about 3 to 6 weeks. And I'll now pass it off to Juliana, who will tell you a little bit more about the bats that we have living in our backyard here in BC and on Vancouver Island.
So there are 18 species of bats found across Canada, and BC is home to 15 of these different bat species, which makes it one of the most diverse regions in Canada for bat species. So here are some photos of the 15 species found in BC. You can see they're all very adorable. Over half of these species, so about 60% of these species are listed as species at risk. And later in the presentation, we'll talk about why they're threatened. There also may be 2 additional species in BC. There have been records of the Mexican free-tailed bat and the canyon bat in BC through found through acoustic recordings. So on Vancouver Island, there are 9 species of bats found here, and 4 of these species are listed as species at risk. So the little brown bat is federally endangered and it's blue listed in BC. This species is heavily impacted by white nose syndrome, which we'll talk about a little later in the presentation, and also habitat loss. The Townsend big-eared bat, you can see on the left here, their ears are 3 to 4 centimeters long, pretty big ears. And so these guys are listed, blue listed in BC, and they're particularly vulnerable to human disturbance as they've adapted to roost in old buildings, which are commonly being torn down and replaced with new structures. The human myotis is blue listed in BC. The species is commonly found near water sources, so they're sensitive to environmental changes, which affects insect prey. And then the hoary bat is also blue listed in BC. And this is one of the 2 species that migrate in the winter, and their main cause of mortality is collisions with wind turbines. So all of the bats in BC are insectivores, meaning they eat insects. A study performed across the state of Wisconsin, where the little brown myotis also occurs. From May through July, they tested guano, also known as bat poop, samples in a range of habitats, and the researchers found that 72% of the little brown bat samples contained mosquitoes. The little brown bat can eat 600 to 1,000 mosquito-sized insects in an hour. That is a ton of mosquitoes. What would we do without these guys? So most bats in BC spend the winter hibernating. Their body temperature is lower, their heart rate slows, and their metabolism drops dramatically. During hibernation, disturbance is a major threat to hibernating bats. When bats are awakened from hibernation, it causes them to burn through their precious energy reserves that they built up over the summer, which makes them more susceptible to illness. And 3 species that are found on Vancouver Island will also use bat boxes as winter roosts, but we'll talk a little bit more about this later. Other species migrate to warmer southern climates to remain relatively active, or they're migrating to a spot to hibernate. So on Vancouver Island, hoary bats are completely migratory. In late August or early September, they start a long journey moving south and traveling as far as Mexico or even Central America to spend the winter hunting before returning to breed. I will pass off to Sydney to chat about the importance of bats.
All right, so bats, the unsung heroes of our nights. So worldwide, bats play a really essential role in pollination, seed dispersal, and pest control. Many species of bat, particularly in tropical and subtropical regions, are key pollinators for plants. Over 500 plant species rely on bats to pollinate their flowers, including species of fruit like mango, banana, durian, guava, and agave. So next time you drink tequila, please cheers the bats because they make that largely possible. Bats also help with seed dispersal, allowing for reforestation and the growth of new plants in various ecosystems. The seeds of some plants, such as Cerciopida, which is a neotropical genus consisting of 61 recognized species, Solanum, which includes nightshades, tropical vines and shrubs, and Visima, which is flowering shrubs and trees in Central and South America. Those plants are all specifically adapted for seed dispersal by bats, and they are often the first plants to recolonize large open areas because the bats are dropping their seeds. Studies have found that old world bats like fruit bats have the potential to disperse small seeds over hundreds and hundreds of kilometers, so really important. This is a Wahlberg's epilated fruit bat with his cheek pouches full of figs. And I don't have anything particular to say about this slide other than I wanted to show you his picture because it's so ridiculously cute. So I had to work him in there somehow. But back to bugs. So bats eat a lot of bugs. About 70% of bat species worldwide are insectivores, and they have really big appetites in order to meet their energy requirements. For example, the little brown bat that Juliana mentioned earlier that can eat 6 to 1,000 insects in an hour, that's about half their body weight, or they'll eat about half their body weight in insects every single night. So lots and lots of insects like mosquitoes that we don't like to have when we're out on our evening walks. And nursing females may actually eat their entire body weight a night while they're caring for their pups. A 2011 study in the journal called Science estimated that the value of bats to the agricultural sector in the US alone is worth roughly around $22.9 billion a year. Ranging anywhere from 3.7 billion to as high as 53 billion a year. So that 22.9 is kind of right in the middle. And these estimates include the reduced costs of pesticide application that are not needed to suppress insects that are being consumed by these bats. Broad spectrum pesticides can be really dangerous to human health and also degrade ecosystem function and devastate natural insect predators. So bats are really important in helping kind of keep our farming as natural as we can in this day and age. And the World Resources Institute estimates that up to about 400 agricultural pest species may have evolved some degree of pesticide resistance, so enter bats as your natural insect control. This study impressively did not take into account the volume of insects eaten by bats in forest ecosystems and the degree to which bats may benefit industries like lumber. It also didn't take into account the critical importance of bats as crop pollinators and seed dispersers. So the actual monetary value of bats is likely far higher than that estimated 22.9 billion a year, because that was just for the agricultural sector. So threats to bats, surprise, it's mostly us. And we'll get into a little bit of those and then later on how you can help protect them. So yeah, like we mentioned, over half of bats in BC are at risk. And the main threats to these guys on Vancouver Island and in BC and also in their entire range in North America, mostly is habitat loss. Climate change is also a really big issue. White nose syndrome, which we'll talk about more later, wind turbines, and also free roaming cats. Those are all not friends to our friends, the bats. So habitat loss is the leading threat to bat survival. Fragmentation of habitat, destruction of roosts, and mitigating human-wildlife conflict are all causing a decline in bat populations. Clearing of land use for human use eliminates warm, dry, safe, and quiet roosting spots used by bats. And fragmentation of the land also disrupts foraging, especially for migrating bats that follow the same route year after year and rely on those spots. Many bat species found on Vancouver Island are typically found within the coastal Douglas fir zone, which is the biogeoclimactic zone that Victoria is located within. And this zone is one of BC's smallest, but also most biodiverse, and also one of its most at-risk zones. In particular, logging of old growth trees, which bats often rely on for roosting sites, is a major threat to these guys. And it's no surprise that climate change is a threat to bats, like with so many other animals and us. Specifically for bats, their flight-adapted physiologies make them really prone to dehydration due to the high surface to volume ratio caused by their general small body mass and their large wings, tails, and membranes. This makes them really susceptible to climate change impacts like severe droughts and heat waves. Other rapid, unpredictable, or unusual changes in weather patterns associated with climate change can also make it difficult for bats to survive. Although some level of fire can help keep forests healthy and provide better habitat for bats, massive wildfires that we've seen in recent years, fueled by hot and dry conditions, can be really harmful to bats by destroying their habitat. Even within secluded caves, bats aren't always safe from the elements. And then on the flip side, those really intense storms, heavy rainfalls, and floods can kill entire roosting colonies of bats trapped in mines or caves, as well as early snow and prolonged freezing temperatures have also killed bats roosting in caves or mines by blocking the entrances with snow drifts or ice, unfortunately causing the bats to freeze to death within their roosts during hibernation. Experts believe that as many as 82% of bat species in North America will be impacted by climate change over the next 15 years, especially due to the severe drought and temperature extremes, which they are anticipating is going to result in pretty sharp population declines. So white nose syndrome is considered to be one of the worst wildlife diseases in modern times, and to date has killed millions of bats across North America. White nose syndrome is a fungal disease that affects hibernating bats across the United States and Canada, and it's caused by a cold-loving fungus. This fungus collects and grows around the muzzle and the wings of hibernating bats, which you can see on the slide there. That guy has the fungus on both his face and his wings. White nose syndrome was first documented in a New York cave in 2006, but has since spread to at least 30 different states in the US and 5 Canadian provinces and is still spreading. This disease irritates the bat's skin enough to wake them up from hibernation too frequently. And this really depletes their energy supplies and their stores, leading to them to wake up from hibernation before their insect food source is available or when it's too cold for them to be out foraging. The good news is that currently white nose syndrome has not been documented in British Columbia. However, it is present in 2 of our bordering neighbors in Alberta and Washington state. So wind turbines can also be really dangerous to migrating bats and also to birds, but we're going to focus on the bats. Migrating bats have collisions with the spinning blades of the turbines and are killed by millions around the world each year. Wind energy facilities impact more than 50% of North American bat species. And in addition to collisions, some bats also can suffer from barotrauma lung damage caused by the rapid and excessive pressure changes in their thoracic or their chest cavity when they're flying too close to these turbines. The good news is that researchers are analyzing bat behavior around turbines to help mitigate the interaction of bats with wind turbines to hopefully help reduce bat mortality around these energy sites. Wind turbine installed bat deterrent systems can amplify ultrasonic output and have been attached to turbines with some promising results as deterrents. These high frequency generators are audible to bats and deter them from approaching the turbine sites. And research is also being conducted on possible ultraviolet lights to illuminate the turbines at night so that bats can see and avoid them. There's also additional research that has shown that operating turbines at lower wind speeds during peak migration season can have a positive effect, so less bats being killed as they're migrating. And last but certainly not least, are free-roaming cats. A recent analysis of wild animal intake and health data from across Canada revealed that cat attacks are actually the greatest source of trauma for bats in our country. In the BC context, a 2022 study found that cat depredation or cat attacks was the most frequent cause of death for bats in the province. And researchers found this by analyzing bats that had unfortunately passed away in a veterinary laboratory. And even if bats manage to escape cat attacks, they can still be fatally injured because cat claws and teeth can easily tear their really delicate wing membranes, which impacts their ability to fly. So one of the simplest things that people can do to protect bats and tons of other wildlife is to keep your cats inside. And I will now pass it off to Juliana, and we'll get into some fun stuff about bats in folklore and busting some more bogus bat facts.
So bats in folklore. Bats have become one of Halloween's most iconic symbols. They're closely associated with this spooky season due to their nocturnal nature and mysterious behaviors. There are images of spooky bats, blood-sucking vampires, witches, and ghosts that are very popular. However, they've also created some fear and misconceptions about bats. There are three extant species of vampire bat that feed solely on blood: the common vampire bat, the hairy-legged vampire bat, and the white-winged vampire bat. Vampire bats are primarily found in Mexico, Central America, and South America. While most other bats have almost completely lost the ability to maneuver on land, vampire bats are an exception. These guys can run using a technique, a bounding gait in which the forelimbs are used instead of the hind limbs to propel them forward, as the wings are much more powerful than the legs. And we don't actually have a video of this for you, but I would recommend looking it up if you can. It's pretty interesting. Um, and these bats, to feed on blood, they've developed an anticoagulant in their saliva. But don't worry, despite horror movie depictions, vampire bats very rarely bite humans to feed on their blood. So there are many myths associated with bats. We've talked about a few of them throughout this presentation. Some other common myths that we kind of just busted: all bats drink blood. So there are actually only 3 species of bats out of 1,400 that drink blood, and this is mostly from cattle. Blind as a bat. So we talked about how bats are in fact not blind, and most species could see quite well. And in fact, some bats have better eyesight than humans, especially in low light. You may have heard that bats are dangerous. While some bats can carry rabies, the overall risk to humans is very low, and bats are rarely aggressive towards humans. It's less than 0.5% of bats that carry rabies. While the risk of contracting rabies is low, we still want to exercise caution by not handling any wildlife with your bare hands. And to put this into perspective, in Canada, there are between 2 to 3 lightning-related deaths and 180 lightning-related injuries reported each year. And in contrast, between 1950 and 2019, there have only been 7 human cases of bat rabies infections in Canada. So that's pretty low. You may have also heard that bats will fly into your hair, and this myth likely stems from their erratic flight patterns while hunting insects. Bats are agile flyers and actively avoid obstacles, including humans. They are definitely more interested in avoiding humans than interacting with us. So understanding these myths help promote awareness and conservation of bats. Bats may seem spooky, but there's no reason to fear them. Despite their reputation, bats are generally harmless to humans, and they're more interested in insects than in us. Most bat species are small, gentle creatures that prefer to keep their distance. They don't attack people and rarely carry diseases that can harm humans. In fact, as we've learned today, bats are incredibly beneficial. They play a vital role in controlling pest populations, pollinating plants, and spreading seeds. Their echolocation skills and nighttime habits make them fascinating creatures to watch from a distance. So instead of fearing bats, we can appreciate them as ecosystem superheroes and also get involved with local conservation efforts. So this slide is just a little reminder of the threats that we talked about that the bats are facing. So habitat loss, climate change, diseases like white nose syndrome, wind turbines, and cats are all things that are affecting bat populations. And there are many opportunities to get involved in bat conservation. So I'm going to talk a little bit next about ways that you can protect our flying friends. And you can start in your own backyard. So making your yard bat friendly, you can by planting native plants, so native trees, shrubs, and flowers. These are going to provide food sources for a diverse range of insects that bats rely on. Native plants also help create a balanced ecosystem, providing bats with natural shelter and foraging opportunities, and they support overall health of all wildlife, including bats. You can also install a water source, like a pond or a bird bath, which can attract both bats and their insect prey. And then, of course, in bat-friendly gardening, avoiding pesticide and herbicides is crucial. These chemicals can harm bats directly and also reduce their insect food supply. So let's be bat buddies. Leave bats where they are. If you have bats roosting in your home, let them be. Bats and humans can safely coexist. We usually recommend leaving bats to roost where they are, as long as they don't have access to human space. Bats rely on us to provide them with structures to roost in. They've lost a considerable amount of their natural habitat over the last 100 years, so they've adapted to human-made structures. And that being said, removing bats is possible. When necessary, we provide guidance on how to use bat-friendly exclusion methods and how to follow appropriate timelines. Bats are protected under the BC Wildlife Act, and they cannot be disturbed during maternity season, which occurs from May 1st to September 1st. So one of the most important measures for protecting bats is to protect their natural habitats. Retaining natural roost habitats like old, mature, and dead trees is really important as long as it is safe to do so. You can also enhance habitat by installing a bat box. So installing bat boxes can provide safe, sheltered roosting sites for bats where they can raise their young. And while bat boxes are a helpful tool for bat conservation, they're just one part of the solution. There's no way to encourage bats into a bat box. They will only use them if they're already roosting in the area. And bat boxes do tend to be most effective when used alongside an exclusion. We do sell bat boxes at Hat, and we can also provide the plans if you want to build the bat boxes yourself. This QR code on the screen here will link to our shop, so you can inquire about the bat boxes there if you're interested. And just a little note, there are a wide range of bat boxes available, so you want to make sure you're choosing one that is suitable for the bats in your area. And a lot of the ones that are sold these days are just a little too small for bats, and so they heat up too quickly or cool down, which is not good for the bats. And who is using these bat boxes? So in BC, there are 3 species that commonly use bat boxes and buildings. So the little brown bat, the Yuma myotis, and the big brown bat. The Townsend's big-eared bat also uses buildings to roost, but not bat boxes. They need quite a bit more space. And these cozy homes help these species thrive in urban and rural environments. However, it's important to note that the 5 other bat species in the region prefer natural roosting sites like trees and caves and don't utilize bat boxes. So bat boxes are just one part of this solution. And you can also support bat species by engaging in monitoring initiatives, which I'll talk a little bit about next. So bats need our help. We learned about white nose syndrome and how it's devastating bat populations. So we need your eyes on the ground. Help us monitor for white nose syndrome. From November 1st to May 31st, we collect dead bats to send them in for white nose syndrome testing. This is really, really helpful. Increasing the number of reports from the public is the best way to understand how white nose syndrome might be affecting local bat populations. So if you do find a sick or dead bat, please report it to HAT or your local BC bat program. Someone from the bat program will give you instructions, but basically you collect the dead bat using gloves and a trowel. You'll refrigerate the bat if it will take more than 48 hours to pick up. There is not yet a cure, but several promising treatment options are being developed. And just a little reminder that white nose syndrome is not harmful to humans. Another way you can get involved is by participating in the annual bat count. The annual bat count is a community scientist program to annually monitor bat population in summer roost sites. Summer roost sites are found in houses, barns, churches, and bat boxes. And monitoring these maternity colonies helps biologists understand how bat populations are doing from year to year. So the bat counts take place in the summer when bats are most active. There are two counts in June before the pups are born, and two counts between July and August when pups are flying and exiting the roost with their mothers. Doing all counts helps us to best compare data from year to year between sites. However, if you don't have time, doing a couple counts is still helpful. Any data counts. And the bat counts are easy and super fun. Counting bats as they emerge from their roost at dusk is a fascinating experience. I would highly recommend it. So basically, you arrive at the roost at sunset as the bats are emerging at dusk to hunt for insects. You'll tally all the bats for up to an hour after they start emerging and then record your data. And after you've completed all 4 counts, you submit your data to the BC Community Bat Program. And who can join? So anyone, you might be wondering what to do if you don't have a bat roost on your property, but you can volunteer with your local bat program. So our bat program relies heavily on volunteers. We really couldn't do this important work without the help of our volunteers. And so species identification is really important for bat conservation because it helps biologists monitor population health, tracks the spread of disease, and helps to understand behavior. So bat guano samples can be collected to identify bat species through DNA analysis. So if you have a roost on your property, you can send in a sample. Guano can be collected throughout the summer, and then in late August, you send your samples to your regional coordinator. And you want to exercise caution when collecting samples. Guano does not contain anything harmful to humans, but wearing gloves is a good idea since you're handling bat poop. And that is the end of our presentation. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you everybody for joining us and for listening. And thank you, Juliana, for your wonderful insights on how we can help bats locally. We will take questions now. I know there's some questions in the chat. So I'm going to get my colleague to read those out, and we'll answer all the questions in the chat first. And then if you have a question that hasn't been answered, feel free to type it in the chat or unmute yourself and ask your question out loud. But yeah, we've got a little bit of time here to answer all those burning questions that you might have about bats. Before we get going with the questions, I'm just gonna do one little plug. We are both charity organizations. So though this presentation was free this evening, if you are able to, please consider supporting our work in any way that you can, whether that be with a donation or with volunteering with the bat counts that HAT does. And both of those QR codes will take you to either Pacific Wild's website on this side here, or to Habitat Acquisition Trust's website on this side here, if you would like to leave a monetary donation. But yeah, thank you for listening, and we'll get going with the questions.
All right, so there are 3 questions and an anecdote somebody has shared here. I'll start with the anecdote because it's nice and heartwarming. The anecdote is that Monica had a bat that flew into their home, and she was trying to find a way to get the bat out, and another bat had flown in and guided that lone bat out of the house. So team bat.
Love that.
Yeah. Okay, and so Elizabeth has 2 questions. The first question that Elizabeth has is, can you please explain the levels of threats to bats? And second, how can I identify the type of bat that is roosting in my house?
Sure. I'll take the first one, so I'll do threats, and then maybe Juliana can do the identifying.
Sure.
So on the threat side of things, we talked about habitat loss. That's really kind of the main threat to bats that we have worldwide. And for so many other animals that are competing for space and resources with us humans. Habitat loss and the fragmentation that we discussed is really kind of the main threats, the main threat that these bats are facing. Also, we anticipate climate change in North America to be a really big issue for bats in the next couple of years. But I would say habitat loss is the biggest one. And then on Vancouver Island specifically, or in BC specifically, sorry, we discussed those vicious house cats that actually are a really big issue for bats. Number one cause of mortality of all the ones that were collected for that study. So I would say, yeah, habitat and that very cute, fluffy, invasive species that we have all welcomed into our homes and then into our backyards. I think
So there was a thanks, Sydney. There was a clarification to that question. Elizabeth asks, what was the color levels of threats, for example?
Oh, yeah. So, okay, so the one that said blue, that's for the BC list. So that's classifying the bats as blue on the BC list, which means they're threatened. And then the red that said Sarah, that is an indication that they are endangered under the Species at Risk Act. So it's just the difference between the provincial level and then the federal level for how those bats are listed as threatened.
Okay, thank you.
And then Juliana, do you want to talk about identifying bats that are roosting in your home?
Yeah. Sorry, could you just repeat the question for that one?
Yep. So the
Thank
question
you.
is, how can I identify the type of bat that is roosting in my home?
Right, yeah. So some of them, like the Townsend big-eared bat, you would definitely be able to identify visually. Like we saw this picture, and I mentioned that they have the big ears. They're 3 to 4 centimeters. So those ones, they are roosting more in open spaces, so like a barn or an attic, and they're kind of funny because they're roosting out in the open. It kind of seems like they think that they're hiding, but you'd definitely be able to tell. And then the other species, the little brown bat, Yuma myotis, and the big brown bat. So those are the ones that are roosting. They also use buildings, but they like to be a little bit more cozy. So they're often like in the siding, or they're ones that use bat boxes. And those ones are actually really hard to tell apart. The little brown bat and the Yuma myotis are they look almost identical. I think the Yuma's a little bit smaller, and I think you need to use DNA analysis to identify those ones. But that being said, you can, if you have bats, you can send in bat guano, and that will help you with the species ID. I can put a link in the chat if you wanted for information on where to send in the guano for species ID as well.
Great. The third question was from Monica, and she's wanting to know in Kenya about bats in Kenya as she goes there every year for wildlife photography.
Yeah, there's quite a few species that live in Kenya, including my favorite, this guy. So cute. Yeah, there's quite a few different species that live in Kenya. If you're interested in bat photography and kind of getting a sense of where different bats live in the world, I would really recommend that you go check out this lovely gentleman down here who's credited for the photo, Merlin Tuttle. He is the bat man. He has spent his whole career studying bats, and he's also one of the world's leading bat photographers. So he travels all over the world and showcases the bats there. And I think he's photographed quite a few in Kenya that are in his gallery. So I would check that out, not only to see some awesome photos of bats, but also to get an idea of what you might be able to see while you're there.
So there was another question that just came in from Barbara regarding a solution to white nose fungus. And perhaps there was a reporting of gas from rotting bananas that white nose fungus responded to for the bats. And there was a follow-up question here. Why don't European bats succumb to white nose fungus? And perhaps should they be introduced?
Yeah, so that's interesting. I don't actually know anything about the first thing that you mentioned, but I think bats in Europe have adapted to be okay with white nose syndrome, which is actually really interesting. And I'm sure that's being studied as well. White nose syndrome is really tricky because it affects bats during hibernation, and we don't actually know much about where they're hibernating. So monitoring when bats come back to their summer roosts, sending in guano, and also sending in dead bats specimens is really helpful to give us information about where white nose syndrome is affecting.
And I'll just add to that, with the should they be introduced point, it may seem like a great idea to introduce a bat that's not being affected by white nose syndrome into an area that needs bats but has a lot of white nose syndrome. However, introducing a non-native species to an area is a pretty complex issue, and sometimes it can actually do more harm than good. Especially if you're trying to look at conserving the native species that you have there. Introducing another species can cause issues with competition for resources. So an introduced bat may actually end up being bad for our native bats. So if we want to save those guys, we should definitely focus on trying to fix the issue for those guys rather than introducing cousins that might cause more problems for them. But it is an interesting idea.
So those are the questions from the chat. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Will. So if anybody has any other questions, I would invite you to write them into the chat now, or if you're comfortable speaking, just unmute yourself and say hello and ask in person. I know sometimes people can be a little bit shy on Zoom, so we'll give it a couple minutes. I don't think we covered everything about bats. So surely any questions you have, please feel free to ask. Yeah, we'll give it a couple minutes just to let people work up the nerve to speak up.
I do have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Does HAT work with the bat group up in Cedar that has apparently a maternity roosting schoolhouse that each year the guano is collected?
Yeah, I've heard about that. So we don't actually, so that is the Mid-Island coordinator. So we just focus on Southern Vancouver Island. So kind of Victoria all the way up to Duncan area. And then there's a Mid-Island program coordinator that coordinates all the way up to like Comox Valley. And then there's another coordinator that does all the stuff up north. But I have heard about that colony. It's pretty amazing.
I have a question if you can hear me.
I can. Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
Great. Yeah, I guess are bats mainly a land-based animal, or I guess are they mostly land-based, or do you find them in the marine environment as well?
So we don't have like marine bats like we have seabirds, but there are some species of fishing bat. So there are bats that live in different parts of the world that will actively fish for food, but because bats do need to come back to land to roost, to land and to roost every day, we don't have true like marine or aquatic species like we see with birds. Bats have a really, really high metabolism, so they don't have the ability to fly all night or glide for days or weeks at a time, like we see with seabird species. But certainly there are bats that eat fish. So I hope that answers your question. So yes, bats that eat fish, but no, not true marine or aquatic species like we get with seabirds.
Thank you very much for that.
Anybody else?
I have a question.
Yes, go for it.
When I was younger, we used to find, we lived on a sort of a remote lake, and there were bats occasionally that we would find sort of struggling on the ground or underneath a shade, and they'd be singular, and we just never knew if they were we always thought maybe they have rabies. And so now I live in a city, and if depending on where you are, there might not be help in finding some place to take a bat that looks sick or injured, or so you put it in a box, and what would you do with it?
Juliana, I'll let you.
Yeah, so depending where you are, like on the island, there are a few wildlife rehabilitation centers, and even if they're not really close to where you are, we often have volunteers situated nearby that could pick up the bat and bring it to the rehabilitation center for you. I think if you weren't able to get a bat to a rehabilitation center, that you would just want to leave it in nature. But yeah, depending where you are, there are some rehabilitation centers available. But
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
yeah.
So there are two questions from the chat. Actually, sorry, three. The first is, do bats eat cicadas?
Do bats eat cicadas? Yes, bats will eat cicadas. I'm not sure of all the different species that will eat cicadas, because that's, from my understanding, a little bit further south. But I do know that pallid bats will eat cicadas in their more southern range in the US. And those are guys that we do have here. Let me see if I can, pull up a photo of one. We don't have them on the island, but we do have them in BC. So those guys there, they will eat cicadas.
All right. And so the next question is, do you have any tips for locating a roost location? Some friends of this poster on around Prospect Lake love watching them, but not sure where they are coming from.
Yeah, I think, well, besides watching and seeing where they're exiting from in the roost, you could also look for guano, which is an indicator. There's often like a pile up of guano where bats are exiting from their roost if you can't see them exiting at sunset. But that being said, you going out at sunset will be the time that you want to be out looking for bats.
All right. And another question in the chat, how does one start identifying the bats in their area? This poster is asking, we'd like to start looking into the DIY bat habitat. I'm assuming the bat boxes that you provided a link for. And this poster is in Arrington, just outside of Parksville. So the question is, how can you identify the bats in the area?
Yeah, so identifying the best way to identify bats would be sending in their guano for species ID. So you would just collect the guano in the summertime, and you'd send it in August to the BC Community Bat Program. I think I put a link to that in the chat. And then there's also, you could connect with the Mid-Island Program Coordinator, because you said you're in Arrington on the island?
Yes.
Correct.
Yeah, so the Mid-Island Coordinator there is Linda, and you could connect with her through the BC. If you go to the BC Bats website, there are all of the regions and the coordinators listed on the website. And that would be who you'd be coordinating with to send in the guano for species ID.
And just as a little aside for anybody, while you guys think of more questions, for everybody in the Victoria area, I'll share a few spots where I've seen bats, and you might consider going out and trying to spot these guys kind of on dusk walks or runs or something like that. And Juliana, please feel free to jump in. I certainly haven't been all over the place, but just the last couple places that I've seen them. Elk Lake has been a really great place to see bats. I walk there in the evenings quite a bit, and I always get so excited as the sun's going down, and try to time when I'm coming out around this one little place with water on both sides where I see lots of bats going back and forth. So that's a really great place to see bats. And then a place that I've been seeing bats a lot lately, well, I guess a couple weeks ago, we just had a big termite emergence. So the female termites coming out of their nests, I guess. And so just right down at Dallas Road, right along through the dog park there, and then down at the beach, I sat and watched them for a long time. My dogs were very happy to be at the park for that long. But that was a really great place to see bats. I don't know if it's just because it was the time of year and they were really taking advantage of all the termites that were out. But that was a really great bat watching place recently.
Thank you for sharing, Sydney. That's really cool. The elk at Elk Lake, Elk Beaver Lake, I don't know if you're familiar, but there are actually 2 bat boxes there. So that's one of the public roosting sites that is available for anybody to go and see bats. So they're kind of close to the Filter Beds parking lot for those of you who are familiar with Victoria. But there's 2 bat boxes there. We do counts there every summer. There's about 200 bats roosting in the bat box, and they're one of them is in a more sunny location, and then one is a little bit more shaded. And so, depending on the temperature, they move between the 2 boxes throughout the summer. It's a really great spot to go and watch the bats coming out at sunset.
Oh, there's one in the chat here. Juliana, this would probably be best for you. Do you travel to communities to do talks?
Yeah, sometimes it depends. We definitely do public bat walks here in the Victoria area. So we do about 3 bat walks. We host them with the CRD, and these are at Elk Beaver Lake. And sometimes we do some talks in the community, just depending on our capacity. We'd like to do them all the time, but yeah, it just depends on our capacity.
And on our end, we do travel to communities to give talks, not on bats. This was kind of just a special little Halloween talk that we were doing, but Pacific Wild does travel around to give presentations. I'm actually the marine specialist, cheating on my whales and fish with bats for the evening. But I do like to go around to communities when we have time and give presentations on herring and whales and salmon and all that kind of stuff. So if you want to learn about that, send me an email.
And for the BC Community Bat Program, I would just recommend reaching out to the coordinator in your region and seeing if they're available to come out to communities.
And then in the chat, Kate said, the best advice I was giving after finding unconscious bats on trails was to place them at the base of a tree near a water source.
That is definitely a good thing to do, because bats need to be up high so they can swoop down and fly. And so putting them at a base of a tree is helpful. They can climb up and then be able to begin flight. And if you can also, using a stick or whatever you're using to move the bat, you could place them even in a branch, which will be helpful to them so they don't have to climb all the way up the tree.
And there's another question. Is there a gentle way to keep them out of the house?
I think having screens on your windows and doors is probably the best way to keep them out of your house if you do see them flying around in your area. Also, possibly, I think having lights on outside your house will attract insects to the lights, which could possibly attract bats. So having the screens will be super helpful in keeping bats out.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to hang out with us this evening and learn about bats. the facts and busting myths and learning about conservation. I hope you guys had a wonderful time. They don't allow us to just talk about bats on an evening unless you guys sign up to hear about them. So thank you very much for choosing to spend your evening with us tonight. Again, if you enjoyed this presentation and you wanted to support either Pacific Wild or HAT, please visit our website. There's lots of ways that you guys can get involved as a volunteer or by leaving a donation. So thank you so much for your support this evening. Thank you for all of your wonderful questions. And especially I would like to thank Juliana for joining us this evening. Thank you for all your knowledge and your passion about our friends, the bats. So I hope everybody has a wonderful evening and we will see you at the next presentation. Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks so much, Sydney.